Welcome, everyone. We're so glad, as always, that you are here joining us, spending some time listening in to what we're sharing on the Field of Flourish podcast. Today is a guest episode, and we're so excited to introduce you to a new colleague and someone that we really believe her purpose and her work will be really beneficial to our audience. So we're so thrilled to bring her to you today. I will let you know a little bit about her. So her name is Miranda Pacchiana. She's a MSW. As a writer, personal coach, creator of the website The Second Wound, and host of the podcast Truth and Consequences. She writes and speaks about recovery from abuse, family estrangement, parenting, and grief, among other topics. A survivor of child sexual abuse, Miranda applies the lessons she's learned through the traumatic events in her own life to provide comfort, information, and support to others. She works and lives in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. And we are so thankful she was willing to chat with us today to talk about the second wound and what this is. So welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
The name The Second Wound just speaks for itself so well, but why don't you jump in and tell us about how this work developed for you and what it is. What is the second wound?
Thank you. Yeah, it is so common, but it isn't really talked about or even researched all that much. I think we're talking about it more now, but I came to this work from my own experience. And I will talk about that today. But first, I'll just tell you a little bit about what I mean when I use the term the second wound, which is something that I coined. So it's all about pulling the curtain back on a type of re-victimization of trauma survivors. I mostly work with sexual abuse and assault survivors, but it does affect all kinds. And it's when friends and family and others in your own community unfortunately re-injure you, often in ways that you've already been hurt with your original trauma. So it's shockingly prevalent to get negative responses when you disclose that you have been abused or assaulted. It's extremely hurtful. It can be persistent. And those of us who suffer from it, because there isn't a lot of information out there, generally end up feeling really confused that we're being responded to this way. We feel alone and powerless to fix it when it happens to us. And part of the reason that it isn't talked about very much is because there is so much shame attached to both sexual violence and family estrangement. So it carries a stigma. And it's hard for people to share that they're estranged from friends, family, other people in their community.
Absolutely. That's so, I just so thankful for you. And I'm sure you've worked with so many people that are thankful for you because you're right. This is not, um, it's misunderstood. It's bypassed sometimes. It's people are uncomfortable with it. So that people are very alienated and isolated in these kind of conversations, and to have a place where they can come and find safety and understanding and in language, because no one talked about it. I'm sure people come to you, it's like, I don't know what this is that I'm feeling. I'm just upset, I'm hurt, and I don't know why.
That's exactly what I'm here to do. So thanks for saying that, Luke. And I can start giving you examples of the way that the second wound plays out. So number one is, let's use the example of someone like me who came forward and said, I was sexually abused as a child. It's something for me that I retained my memories and knowledge of, but it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s, I had gotten married, I had moved away from, where I grew up. I was living this more adult life, and I was in therapy. I had a trusted relationship with my therapist. And so I decided that it was time for me to talk about what I had remembered. Now, at the time, I was in social work school and I knew all about child sexual abuse, and I was very compassionate to victims and concerned about the risk and all of that. I didn't connect that to what I had been through, which is a form of denial, really.
Sure.
So I started doing this work and addressing it, and which is, really challenging, as you know. And I did disclose to my inner circle. And so some of the reactions that are that happen initially are either people don't believe you, or what people also, I think, don't realize is that minimization of your experience is probably more common than disbelief,
Yeah.
but it's just as devastating.
Mhm.
Sometimes there's an initial, oh, I'm so sorry, that's terrible. But then the people in your life fail to really incorporate and appreciate the impact of this information that you're sharing and how it affects your life. And so they minimize it.
Yeah.
So denial and minimization are the two initial reactions that I talk about. Um, minimization leads to wanting to just brush it under the rug and asking the survivor to go on with their life and their interactions, possibly even with the person who abused them or the people who failed to
Protect them.
protect you.
Yeah.
And that's not healthy. And once you start to push through your own avoidance and denial of your own experiences of trauma, you start to feel all of those things, and you can't walk back into the place where it happened or see the people who were involved without being hugely impacted physically and emotionally, right?
Yeah. Yeah. You just touched on so many key aspects. Not just the denial and minimization, but that just there at the end where you just like what we talk about it like physiological expression. Like when you go into a the town or the house or see the picture of a person that hurt you, your body
Exactly.
responds to that. And having that's such a huge part of understanding and healing from those second wounds, or learning how to even support somebody so that they're not wounded a second time. Of like they see a picture, oh, why are you scared? Like it's just a picture, it's not going to hurt you. Like
Hmm.
that, my body doesn't know that, my body is remembering that trauma. And so I think that is such a huge part of I'm glad you mentioned, and something that we work with a lot and see a lot. um
It's
and
important for people to understand too, because up until that point, you may have spent time with the person or people who hurt you,
Right.
because you had a desensitization,
yep,
and there's all kinds of reasons behind that. You may not have had much choice.
yep.
It is a form of denial. Often people like that sweep you into their orbit for all
Mm,
kinds of reasons. And so people are confused. I thought you were friends with them,
yeah.
or I thought you were maintaining contact with them. How come all of a sudden you don't want to come to the family gathering where they're there? We don't get it.
You can call it denial, but it's also an adaptation. It's like
True.
I've learned how to I've had to survive by denying it, or um, disembodying from that fear, from my body physiological response. And now that I'm doing the work, or now that I'm noticing it, I can't do that anymore. Um, and
Exactly, which is
and
healthy, actually. It's a
it's
step
very
forward.
healthy. Yep. And a lot of people
Right.
also say like why are you so upset about it now? You've been okay, or like therapy's not helping you. You're getting worse. You're feeling all this again, and it's like, no, actually, that's better. Now that I'm feeling it is actually a sign of progress, because then you can work through it rather than denying it, disembodiment, adapting.
Exactly. Yes. And I'll tell you a quick story about my own experience. So like I said, I was in my mid-20s. I was in social work school. I was doing a field placement where I worked at a school for kids with developmental disabilities. Working with children was my original concentration.
Okay.
And I was digging into my own trauma in my therapy. I was raw. I had trouble leaving the house some days.
Mm.
I talk about how my husband and I had this sweet little antique house with a fireplace, and I would sit by the fire on a Sunday night and just weep because I knew the next day I had to go out into the world.
Yeah.
And all of my shame and pain had been dug up, and I felt like that little girl that was afraid to go to school because the world would see how bad I was, right? I felt
Wow.
all of that again. And so here I was at this field placement. I had all these lovely colleagues who worked in the school, therapists and teachers. And I was so insecure that they knew me as this person who wasn't very social. I'm actually quite a social person, but at this time I wasn't. I was very anxious about speaking in a meeting or just interacting. And I managed to focus on my work and learn a lot there. But so we go through the 9 or 10 months of the school year, and I decide that summer I'm just going to rest a bit after such a difficult emotional upheaval. I take some time off over the summer, and I came back to the school at the end of the summer for it was a year-round school, so they had a kindergarten graduation, and one of the children I did play therapy was graduating, and so I came to see her walk. And I show up at the school, and everybody does a double take, and they say, "You look so good. What did you do?" I mean,
Wow.
I didn't tan or, get new makeup or anything. I was just feeling like a different person
Mm.
because I had sort of taken all that junk out of the closet and worked through the initial stage and put it back more
Yeah.
neatly. And I was feeling whole in a way that I never had in my life.
Wow. Yeah.
And people could just
Wow.
see it in my face.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
By this point in your journey, we work a lot with people who have physical bodily symptoms from chronic stress and trauma. And it's just so prevalent. And thankfully, it's like in the research now, it's very obvious that these things affect the physical body. We already know it affects the mind and the emotional world, but I'm just curious, like by that point, had you been experiencing any physical symptoms, or did you
Oh,
address it before
yes.
it developed? Okay.
I had chronic, debilitating stomach aches
Mm.
ever since it started,
Wow.
which I think it developed into food allergies because I had trouble digesting
Yeah.
things. So
Yeah.
fortunately, over the years, I found a lot of different ways of eating and, alternative treatments and things like that actually have really helped. And I'm just easy on my stomach now, and it's much better. But no, it was really acute. And also I had that kind of hypervigilance that I'd carried through my
Totally.
whole life, and I didn't
Yeah.
even know that that was different.
Yeah.
Right. I was just
Right.
scared all the time.
Yep.
And that's complicated. I also had a bipolar dad who
Mhm.
could kind of snap without warning. And it was like everything sort of fell apart in my world when that happened. So I learned
Yeah.
to just always be on alert.
Yeah.
And that is something that helps to identify and actively try and unlearn, which I
Right.
actually
Right.
feel so much better today after just
Amazing.
creating a much safer life for myself and doing physical exercise and just learning how to take care of myself better.
Yeah. So you were just talking about like entering into that room and people noticing the difference in you. When we look at Stephen Porges's work of the polyvagal theory, um, and we talk about the safe and social, sympathetic nervous part of the nervous system and the shutdown. Um, for safe and social, which is our social engagement networking, we give off pro-social signals through our face expression. And when we are in sympathetic or shutdown, we're not have access to that pro-social signals. So, but when we are working through our stuff and finding safety and not feeling threatened or in like being scared all the time and in that sympathetic state, then our body actually physiologically expresses pro-social signs, say that we're safe, and then people's neuroception see that and say, "Oh, there's something different about you." And it's subconscious,
Yeah.
but it's a survival technique of so that we can pick up on who's safe from our story, and so we can also send signals to people to attract safe people and vice versa. So it's really fascinating that people even notice that shift, and it's a subconscious micro expression level.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Also, because you as you can imagine, I felt ashamed that I was so unable to connect with them and walk in there with confidence. So
Yep.
I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that
Yeah.
feeling.
Yeah. And it's not a choice that you make, it's a physiological response that happens actually in a 0.05 seconds of entering into a room. Your body decides whether it's safe to go to safe and social, or that you need, based on your experience, you need to go to sympathetic or shut down or safe and social. So that's
Mhm.
something we work a lot with, is that shame of like, why can't I just do this? Why can't I just overcome this? Why can't I just think my way through it? Why? It's like,
Well, and when
it's
you
not a
have this
choice.
background of having shame be such an integral part of your sense of yourself from childhood or from whenever it happens,
Yep.
it exacerbates it. So yeah, and we tend
Exactly.
to blame ourselves,
Yep.
which is important to look at. I'd like to talk a little bit too about going back to the concept of not feeling comfortable showing up at certain events with your,
Mhm.
let's say your place of worship, your family, your community of some sort.
Yeah.
And one of the negative and hurtful ways that people respond to trauma survivors is by ostracizing us.
Hmm.
That's a huge one. I'm sure you are both familiar with. So, for example, let's go back to feeling like you can't be there with the abuser or enablers. And let's say a family, because I hear this story all the time, will respond by saying, well, we don't understand that really, but also we might sympathize, but it's so inconvenient for everyone that you can choose to come or not, but we're
Yeah.
not going to disinvite those people. We're
Yes.
not going to take steps to make it safe for you because that disrupts everything.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that is a terrible choice to
Yeah.
be given. It's not healthy to override that need to protect yourself.
Right.
And so that's one of the first things that happens to survivors
Mm.
that
Yeah.
is part of this second wound
Yeah.
hurt.
And the whole idea of, I love you just said, it's not healthy actually to override that
Hmm.
need for protection. And I think that it was Porges also that said it's not
Hmm.
it's maladaptive if your body actually puts you in that safe and social space when you're not really safe. Like the point
Right.
of the nervous system is to know if you're safe or not. So actually to override that and force a safe and social nervous system state in the presence of unsafety is totally against our wiring as creatures that survive and that
Hmm.
know how to.
Exactly. And also, I'd like to point out that there are subtler versions of this too. It's funny. I
Mm.
woke up this morning having had a dream about being with a bunch of people in my extended family who, in the dream, were not being supportive of me. And I was confronted with someone who in real life is extremely supportive of me, informing me that he was spending time with the person who abused me,
Mm.
which would never happen in real life, but a number of
Right.
things that are similar have happened, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And here I was disappointed and disillusioned yet again that people don't want to inconvenience themselves to stand up for me, even if they believe me, right? So
Yeah.
that is sometimes even harder because it's not as cut and dried, and you don't want to be alienated from the people that you've always known, especially when you're hurting and you're healing, right?
Yeah.
It's a terrible bind to be stuck in.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the second wound really takes root and puts you in this trap that does activate your nervous system. You know, how do I get them to see this? How do I explain it to people and get them to be compassionate with me? And most of us really do try and go back again and again and again. And we think if we just word our email correctly, or we show them how devastated we are, they'll understand. But oftentimes people have limitations and they make choices that aren't as morally upstanding and compassionate as they should be.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Why do you think this, like you said, this is a phenomena that so many people experience such significant, they experience the abuse and then the second wound being so common? Like, why?
It's such an important and big question, and there are a lot of reasons. The first one that comes to mind is, okay, so that system that you're in, let's say it's your church community or your extended family. If you experienced trauma and abuse in that system, you're probably not the only one. So we're talking about people who may be really opposed, not opposed, but emotionally unable or unwilling to look at these types of issues because they may have experienced it themselves. They may have been bystanders and not done anything. They might have a very similar trauma that they're not ready to look at or not willing to look at. And if anything, they're going to act in opposition to it. One thing that I learned that I think is really helpful to understand is that sometimes, without doing it consciously, people actually try to normalize their own abnormal experiences by recreating them. So, for example, a dad who doesn't protect his children from a known sexual abuser, in his own mind, is making it okay that he was treated that way as a child and he wasn't protected. And it's like turning a blind eye or shrugging at something that actually devastated him, but he doesn't want to admit that to himself.
Wow.
Another important reason, sorry to interrupt you, Lee.
No, go ahead.
Another important reason is that oftentimes abusive people have charm, they have clout, they have power, they have money, they may even have fame, and they have all these goodies that they kind of dole out to get people aligned with them. And if you stand up against them or you stand up with the hurt person, well, you're risking not only those goodies, but even your status and your acceptance within the group. You're risking a backlash yourself. You might see what's happening to the victim and say, I don't want any part of that. I don't want to be subjected to that. So I'm just going to stay neutral, which is not
a joke,
a reasonable option. Thank you. Yeah, a lot of people just try to not really know and stay out of it. And I just want to say that's not a moral stance.
Yes.
Because you're not talking about an argument between people. You're talking about someone that harmed someone else. And so you don't get to just say, I'm out of it. It's between them.
Right. That was one of my points I was going to make, is that not wanting to be ostracized themselves. So they're really looking out for themselves. So consciously, they've seen what happens to other people. They know the system. They know what happens to people that push up against the system.
I think sometimes the people that get the angriest at survivors are people who were abused themselves.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can see that with, I don't know if you're familiar with IFS. That's something we use, internal family systems. And it's like, when you see extreme polarization in the internal family, oh, wow, there's or when you see extreme reactivity, there's usually a polarized part going on. So if you look at that societally, like, okay, so here's the victim and they're the weak, wounded person here in this scenario, very vulnerable, very in need of protection and support. But in the face of that, then you have this extreme polarized reaction to that of, like you said, the angriest, the most vile, the most dismissive, the most even like slandering of that person. It would make sense that inside them, they also have that same part, that same wounded part of them, but they can only respond, like you said, they can't really look and see what's happened to them and their story. Like they're just not capable of that at that point. And so that it'd be a protector that comes out that's very big and explosive and violent, even to maintain the suppression of that wounded part.
Right. And to shut down that other survivor. And it is so hurtful and painful. But I also want people to know that while I wouldn't suggest that anyone hold out hope that someone's going to turn around their stance, because it doesn't happen very often, it does sometimes happen. Sometimes, if you think about the fact that the average age of disclosure for child sexual abuse is 52, which is really surprising to a lot of people. When somebody like I did gets in touch with their past and their trauma, it's a form of waking up. People do wake up at any age. And sometimes people wake up and realize this happened to me. I'm going to look at it. And now I understand what Miranda's doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's rare, but it's possible.
Exactly.
It's possible.
So one concept that I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with is the idea of the scapegoat. And that's really what we're talking about here. The second wound is all about scapegoating. And a person's experience tends to be, the victim is pointed out as the problem. You're the troublemaker here. You're the one disrupting everything. We get it. You were sexually abused, whatever. You're responding in a way we don't like. You didn't tell us correctly. You're too emotional. You're expecting things from us we don't want to deal with. I have this banner on my website when you open it up that says, you are a truth teller. You are not a troublemaker. It's such an important distinction, but truth tellers get treated like troublemakers. We didn't commit abuse. We're naming abuse. So who's the troublemaker here, really? But it gets twisted around. I call it upside down and backwards. And it's so hard to understand that when you're in it, when you're being treated this way. I also tell a story about being in therapy and challenging my therapist in these early years and saying to her, okay, I hear what you're trying to tell me, that I'm actually in the right here or that I'm being mistreated. But let me ask you this. If everybody in a system is pointing at you and saying you're the problem, isn't it your responsibility to reflect on maybe you're the problem? And she looked at me so compassionately and she said, you have to consider the system.
Yes.
There are systems where that's what they're going to do, and it's not true and it's not healthy. I mean, my question, the answer is yes, philosophically, in general, in life, right?
Right.
But we're so used to hearing that we're at fault or that we're wrong that it's hard. It's really hard to kind of deprogram yourself from that messaging. And that's what I'm here to help to do.
Yes. Yeah, I love that reminder, because that is something I hear that a lot as well. And if you're calling out a part of a system or a system that's like dysfunctional and they're pointing back at you as dysfunctional, that's like the cue of like, it's the system that is the problem. It's not you that's pointing out the problem. But it can be so gaslighting and confusing.
And usually the healthiest person in a dysfunctional system gets
Yes.
treated like the outsider.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if that's you, you can stand tall and know that you're the person who's saying, I'm going to look at this, I'm going to tell the truth, I'm going to address the hard stuff, and I'm going to break this generational curse.
Yeah.
Mm.
Man, so many things already have been said. I think like that one is so important, that they can, to encourage people to stand their ground against evil, against dysfunction. And sometimes maybe you have to stand alone, but that's not because you're wrong. It's maybe because you're the healthiest one that is trying to change the system and challenge the system, and being invited to change the system. And sometimes when you do that, you're seen as self-righteous or arrogant or divisive. Yeah, but
Maybe you're not self-righteous, you're just righteous because you're right.
right.
Right. And also, Miranda, you probably find this too, but we just see like the whole idea of the question you asked your therapist in session, like, shouldn't I be self-reflective? Like all of these people are saying this, shouldn't I? We find that survivors tend to be very reflective and very willing, like overly willing to take the blame. Obviously, that's what we're talking about. When really it's a completely different scenario for the opposing party. So it's just ironic that when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to see. No, you are open, you are willing to see the truth, and you've seen it. And it's just so hard to accept that you kind of want to like, oh, let's just balance the blame out. Maybe it is me, when really some things there's no balance that exists. Abuse and harm, there's no, let's both take our weight. We both know that's not how it works, and that's not the nature of it. So these good-hearted people that really want to be diplomatic and really see things in such a balanced way, then they tend to blame and not see it. Yeah, it takes time, like you said, to deprogram that conditioned response to harm and see where the fault really lies.
And a person who is empathic and cares about being a good person is going to reflect on those things and be more influenced by being told they're arrogant, right? Because they don't want to be doing the wrong thing.
Yep.
So I think people take advantage of that sometimes.
I was going to say, I find that a lot of people take advantage of that victim of saying, oh, I'm sorry that I said this. And like, I said this, but you did all of this, but I'm gonna say sorry to this so that maybe they'll see a little bit. And it's like, they don't see any of that. And like, yep, see, you're wrong. It's like, wow, that backfired.
Yes.
Like, so even sometimes it's not even good to try to take a fraction or just like maybe find a part where maybe I should have responded differently or worded something differently, because that's actually counterproductive, because they latch onto that because they don't want to reflect. They just want to put blame on you. And so I even give hesitation to people when they're trying to confront apologizing or taking any blame for that reason.
I concur with you on that. And I think it's really common for people to say, you did it wrong. You told us wrong. You responded wrong. And if you think about it, if someone is expressing that they were highly traumatized and abused in a system, you really expect them to be perfect doing that? Why is that your expectation? That's really just an excuse. It's a red flag that shows you that they're latching on to something. I call it a fill in the blank. If it's not this, it's this. And that's what we're going to focus on, instead of just being compassionate to you and not nitpicking how you responded emotionally to being hurt psychologically.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. If people really wanted to hear and have empathy and love you, they're not going to worry about you are too emotional or too passionate or too angry or too this. It's like they're going to see that emotions like pain and like, oh, like, thank you for inviting me into this. I'm so sorry I didn't know this. Not, well, yeah, maybe I did this, but you hurt my feelings when you told me I was mean. Like,
Yeah. And I think it's important to say that we can have room for people blundering, and making mistakes through
Yeah.
learning this
absolutely.
information and trying to incorporate it, because it is a
Absolutely.
really devastating thing to find out that, say, your spouse abused your child or something
Mhm.
like that. I mean, that's going to upend your whole world. And I understand why people at first don't want to let that information in, but
Sure.
it is their responsibility. And I think there's a lot of misconception about what survivors want.
Mm,
I recently on my podcast interviewed Dr. Judith Herman, who wrote Trauma and Recovery, and she has this new book, which is a follow up called Truth and Repair.
mm,
And she explains that survivors, for the most part, are assumed to want vengeance
mm.
and want to put an abuser in jail. But in fact, most people aren't even that interested in the abuser. They just don't want to ever see them again. They want
Yeah.
their community and their loved ones to acknowledge what happened
Yeah.
and to step up as a community and show their support and their integrity.
Mm,
And we want to heal together. We want to go back and say, okay, now that we know what happened, can we look at it? Can we figure out what went wrong and what we can do differently now?
yeah.
This hurts all of us. It does. So
Yeah.
we can have compassion and room for that too.
Hmm. Yep.
But unfortunately, most of us don't get that opportunity to do that work together.
That's true.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how does the systems of power and hierarchy and control, how does that understanding that, how important is it to understand that as you learn about the effects of abuse in the second wound?
I think it's really crucial. I think it on a individual level, people respond poorly to trauma survivors because in their own world, they don't want to upset that hierarchy, whether it's um, the people who work in their school or house of worship or family, um, or it's more societal, right? Like Harvey Weinstein, for example, was on this huge pedestal, and that really worked for him. And a lot of people knew what he was doing, but you can't knock him off that pedestal. And if you stand up to him, you're going to lose your whole career in the entertainment industry,
Hmm.
right? So I especially have paid a lot of attention to all of the uproar going on in a lot of our churches lately. A lot of
Yeah.
things have been revealed, and for the most part, their responses tend to be, um, victims are either lying or they need to forgive and forget immediately, and we're going to just keep the system as it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a huge problem. And
Hmm.
that enables abuse happening in the first place, too,
Absolutely.
and continuing. It's really dangerous. Not just churches, but the Boy Scouts, youth sports, adult sports too,
Yeah.
um, all kinds of systems.
Yeah. Absolutely. Understanding the like abuse and the misuse of power and system powers of system, um, understanding that is so crucial to um I mean, not that like I want to say like believing victims, but it's like not because people should understand to believe them, but like when you understand how many ways power is misused for abuse, um, like people can understand when somebody shares it, like that wouldn't be a surprise, but people only think abuse happens like in these ways, in these situations, in these families. Um, but when you realize all the different ways that a, a power could be misused, and even like sexual abuse isn't just like touching or inappropriate touching. It's like it's words, it's body language,
Images.
it's image. Yeah, it's
Yes.
so much different stuff. And when we understand all of that, there's less minimization. because it's like, oh, it was only that. No, that's abuse. That's wrong. That's
Yes.
understanding that they had the power, they had the position, they had the control, they had the influence, and they misused that.
Yeah.
And they didn't, the other person didn't have a choice. They didn't have an option. They didn't have a voice. It's like, then, yeah, that dynamic, it can be, I hate to say this, but like believable, because it can be, it's, you might have to edit this, Lauren. But I don't know if
I think the word you're looking for is understandable.
yes.
It's easier to understand when you understand.
Yes, because I don't want to say like it's not, people aren't believable, but like I think
Yeah,
a lot of people minimize because they don't understand like how could that happen? How
right.
and so yeah, maybe understandable is a better word.
So there's another important way that people re-victimize trauma survivors. And many of these well, actually all of these I've experienced firsthand.
Mm,
And I think this was the last one that I really came to understand how it's kind of shocking how much smear campaigning there is going on about survivors
Mm,
in their worlds that they often don't have any idea really to the extent of it. People will make up stories whole cloth to discredit you. And even people that you thought originally would be on your side, you really might not know what the rumors are or what the gossip is or what the talk is behind your back. And I think that's really sad and depressing to hear, but I do think it's important for people to
mm,
understand that.
yeah.
And some of the go-to stories they tell are this person is a liar, a proven liar. The most common one is this person is mentally ill or unstable.
Mm,
wow.
And that's not so hard to get people to believe when a survivor is acting emotional and upset and
Yeah,
doing things like all of a sudden not showing up to family events and
yeah,
looking depressed, right?
yeah. Yeah.
Um, so hurtful. And there is also a level of misogyny there where women
Yep.
tend to be discredited,
Yep.
whether it's your friends and family, the public at large, law enforcement, even judges
yeah.
tend to have a preconceived notion about the stories that women tell. And
Yep.
research says there's very few false allegations,
Right.
right?
Yep.
If anything, victims tend to not tell what
Right.
happened to them
Right.
because we know what happens, right?
Exactly. Especially a woman.
Mhm.
They'll be, I'll be said, I'm too emotional, I'm too dramatic, I'm exaggerating, I wanted it, I asked for it, it was consensual. And so a woman's
Mhm.
like, why put myself through that second wound when I know what I'm
Yes.
gonna face? And
And sometimes victims doubt themselves, did
mm,
I not make it clear or did I participate
Yeah,
in it? And I
yeah,
want to just say really clearly, first of
yeah,
all, minors cannot ever consent to any kind of sexual activity. That is
right,
just, that's
yes,
the law and that's psychology. And there's a reason for that. Okay.
yeah,
right.
Um, People get, children and adults get coerced into things, and that can be very confusing, as you guys know.
yeah,
Um,
Yeah,
but I also, when I talk about the smear campaign aspect of it, I want all of us to think about when we hear a story about someone, just always take it with a healthy dose of skepticism and realize that even if
mhm.
the person telling you this seems reliable, we don't know the whole story. Maybe they
yeah,
don't know the whole story. And let's just not assume that this is completely accurate
yeah.
with
Yeah,
the people in our lives.
That's uh really well said. And going back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about like children, like there's not consent. They don't have, they can't consent. Also the idea of um, even if you participate or because you said like, did I say no? Did I give the wrong message? Like even if you didn't say no, that doesn't mean consent.
Absolutely.
Which
So
is
important.
yeah, a very important thing because again, a lot of people are like, well, I like froze. I don't remember what I said. I don't know what I did, or I didn't do anything. That doesn't mean you wanted it and consented. That means you were traumatized.
And
And
in
very
fact,
different.
that's an extremely common and very natural response.
Exactly. That doesn't mean you wanted it or consented to it or is okay that it happened.
And even more complex, with more complexity, the idea that there could also have been arousal and enjoyment that like plagues people with feeling complicit.
Yep.
Because their natural human body responded like a human body would.
Exactly.
And that is such a profound thing for victims to understand. That's also irrelevant.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that it was healthy, safe, consensual, wanted, asked for, nothing. And I know there's a lot of contempt, self-contempt, and for folks with that.
That is such a crucial point, Lauren. I think that's something that people struggle with so much. It feels like you were okay with it or that you participated in it, but you were forced into a situation. And if your body responded, and some people, especially when they're kids, they don't even know that this is wrong. They're taught by the adult or the older child, which is also very common. And people don't realize that, or not even an older child necessarily, but a peer. They're given the impression that this is normal and okay. And so when they discover that this isn't normal, there's so much shame and hiding. And certainly it's hard to talk about having had, physical enjoyment. But I'm so glad you brought that up, because we do need to destigmatize that for people.
I think that's where a second one can come in too, is what, did you enjoy it, or did you like it, or did it feel good? And it's like, well, yeah, oh, then you asked for it. And it's like, no. Misunderstanding that it's a normal response. There's no shame in that.
It really compounds the trauma of it too.
Yep. For
sure. I'm curious, Miranda, I was listening to, I wish I had the name, I don't remember. I was listening to another podcast, a man who researches sexual trauma, and he said that a lot of folks, because like you said, they're a child and they don't actually know what's even happening, let alone that it's wrong. But then when they become an adult and they start putting the pieces together of, oh my goodness, this person was my babysitter or my so-and-so, and they recognize it. And then actually the trauma symptoms come then. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. That was very interesting to me. He was saying, like, it's not even a suppressed memory. Right. It's a correctly understood memory.
Yes.
And that changes the game of, it's almost like the body then can feel the weight and the trauma of it. Whereas before it was like, I don't know. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing for people to understand is, you're taught things by the people in your world as a child, and you just believe them. You have no choice. This is how you learn. And to put those pieces together later, it does all of a sudden become a trauma. And then there's variations of it too. I talked with Sarah Klein on my podcast, who is an attorney now, who is one of the first survivors of Larry Nassar. She was friends with him when these allegations came out, because she didn't put together that the way he was treating her was not normal. Her body knew. She had terrible physical symptoms for years and years that she couldn't figure out the reasons for.
Wow.
But she says when she first heard this, and she had no reason to doubt her teammates, her response was, not Larry. But now she gets it, of course.
Wow.
Ooh. Yeah.
Gave me goosebumps.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack. I mean, and that's going to take years and a lot of work for a survivor to separate what you once knew but now you see it in the completely opposite way, and you need to see it, but also how devastating, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Ignorance is bliss until it's not bliss. Like you said, the body knows and it held it and she needed to know, but then the fallout from waking up to that. Ooh.
Exactly. And we've all talked today about the feeling of aloneness that comes from living in the second wound. And what I want to leave people with that I think is so, so important is that you can go on to have a good life. I am an example of that. I did not leave my trauma behind. We never truly do that. It's still part of my life. And I continue to work on it, and I always will. I'll probably be in therapy the rest of my life, which I think is actually great because it's helped me evolve in all kinds of other situations and ways.
Sure.
But back to the idea of being alone, it's so devastating. And often usually we felt so alone in our abuse. We felt so scared and ashamed and helpless and silenced. But you really are not alone because there's an army of us, of brave people who are doing our work and speaking the truth, whether it's publicly or just to ourselves or our journal or our therapist or our loved one. I feel like I picture all of us, spanning the globe and holding hands and supporting each other
Beautiful.
because there's so many of us. And when we connect to this phenomena and to each other in various ways, it really does help to change the outlook that we've lived with and the upside down backwards world that is being reflected to us. We are not the troublemaker. We are not self-righteous or arrogant. We are not trying to make problems. We're trying to heal problems. And prevent future problems.
Right. Making this world safer and more whole and healthy. It's crucial for all of us, like you said.
And that's another thing that Judith Herman identified in this book, that the vast majority of survivors, like our number one priority, if the person who hurt us is still out there, is preventing it from happening to other people. And we feel a responsibility, sometimes a crippling burden. But most people just want to make sure it doesn't happen to others.
What a worthwhile desire. Yeah, such a noble and meaningful work. And that's why we're so thankful for you in the second wound and just, really humbled by the blood, sweat, and tears that you and other advocates and healers like yourself put into this work, because victims are so worth it. They're so we see victims of abuse as a marginalized group, and they're often in marginalized groups as well, other marginalized groups, and there's so much that they deserve that they just aren't receiving. So to see resources like yours out there, and so many even free resources for people to learn and grow from, it's such a beautiful gift. And just as we wrap up, well, first, is there anything else you wanted to say as we finish?
Thank you. I actually just had another thought that I'd love to share
Okay, great.
that might surprise people, is that I have learned doing this work also that trauma survivors of any kind, natural disasters, mass shootings, are inevitably re-traumatized in some way. Are inevitably re-victimized in some way. And the person who first said that to me is my friend David Wheeler, who he and his wife are dear friends of ours, and they've both been on my podcast. Their son, Benjamin Wheeler, was killed at Sandy Hook School. And I think
Oh my
when
God.
that happened here in my community 10 years ago,
Yeah.
one of my initial thoughts was how unusual it is that our community is being embraced by the whole world.
Mhm.
You know, there's so
Mhm.
many terrible victims of gun violence every day around this country, unfortunately, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
there was such a swelling of compassion, and so quickly I was shocked to find the opposite started happening, right? There started this whole conspiracy theory about how it wasn't really true, and family members started being harassed, and it became a huge, huge problem. You know, there are many parents who've had to move because they're not safe in their homes
Wow.
from harassment. And that is a really awful example. Um, but re-victimization is some kind of thing that just I think all of us need to be aware of, that we
Yeah.
watch out for.
Yeah.
Mhm. It's a terrible
And
example, but it's very, very clear and vivid. I mean,
Mhm.
it really paints the picture of how real this is.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So my friend Francine, who is Benjamin's mom, she was one of my first guests on the podcast, and I named that episode "You Can Still Have Joy."
Mhm.
And she talks to listeners about how living with such a profound, profound loss and missing her son so much is like it's like not having arms or legs. She says it's like you're moving through the world and you look like a intact person, but she feels like she doesn't have arms or legs.
Yeah.
And yet she left us with this message that her life does have joy, and it does have beauty, and you can go on. And there were moments initially where she wasn't sure she wanted to live,
Mhm.
Yeah.
but and that's of course a real extreme example of loss and pain and tragedy and trauma, but every one of us has some form of that, and we can find the joy by living in our truth and
Mhm.
being brave and doing the hard work. And
Mhm.
still, in fact, the more that we do that, the more that we can feel the joys and wonderful moments that come into
Exactly.
our lives.
Yeah.
Yes.
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 The more we become embodied and do the work, we're able to enjoy life rather than being disembodied and
And stuck in
Exactly.
the trauma of it all. Yeah. I
right.
mean, that is a beautiful message to end on. And that is,
Yes.
I think the work that all three of us are doing, and so many other people in this field, and beyond this field, because life, there's so many ways to heal and to step back into your true self. And trauma and abuse wants to steal and wants to just make everything gray, and
Mhm.
really what we're made for is a life of beauty and color and enjoyment. And that's so hard to do when you've experienced so much pain. And so it's like we kind of call it like a slowly coming back to life, or like switching from grayscale to HD. And that takes time, and that takes
Mhm.
just a courage that a lot of people know nothing. I shouldn't say that. A lot of folks who haven't had abuse and trauma don't recognize how much goes into waking up every day, and saying that you are worth those steps you're going to take that day, no matter how small they are. So we just want to extend that hopeful encouragement that healing is possible. It happens every day, and that your story is worth the truth, and it's worth the healing that will come as you walk through that truth and heal. So where can people find you, Miranda? What do people, what can they know about what you offer in your world?
They're welcome to come to secondwound.com, and I have a blog there and all kinds of information and education and messages to understand this phenomena better. And on the website, they'll find links to my social media, The Second Wound, it's called, on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And you'll also find information about my podcast. It's called Truth and Consequences, Navigating the Aftermath of Trauma. So I hope they'll come pay a visit and get some comfort and information.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All righty. Well, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and we'll see you next time.